wonderful new initiative, Univ in the Arts. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the aims of that initiative and how it came into being. And then I'm going to introduce you to John Earls, who's going to introduce you to our distinguished guests. But first, it would be remiss of me not to say a huge thank you to Killick & Co. for allowing tonight's proceedings to take place in this incredible room, the music room as it's known. A more apt location from which to launch a new forum for discussing the arts and the humanities in general, it would be hard to find, since number 46 Grosvenor Street was bought back in 1899 by one Sir Edgar Speyer, who, as well as helping build the very first underground railway system in London, was also a great patron of the arts, and he deployed the finest craftsmen in Europe to build this amazing place, and he also encouraged lots of artists across its threshold, including Richard Strauss and Claude Debussy, both of whom played in this very room. So we follow therefore tonight in the wake of the most excellent company, and I'm very grateful to Killick for that chance. But back to Univ. It's perhaps fitting that this opening event takes the form of conversation, because as with many of the biggest and best ideas, the whole notion of Univ in the Arts began over a year ago as a conversation, so I'm told, between Caroline Marriage, who sits on the Univ Development Board, and the Master, when she suggested to him that the college could do more for old members like herself, who were very interested in creativity, as well as being passionate about the arts and the humanities in general. Members who would leap at the chance to have more gatherings with like-minded souls, to promote discussion about things that matter, as well as enjoying the mutual support that having such discussions brings. The first I knew of it was when, this time last year, the Master got in touch with me and invited me to lunch to pick my brains about something, he said. We had a very exciting and productive conversation, a very good lunch, mulling over all the people we could reach out to amongst Univ alumni who'd be interested in an idea like this, and how best to encourage their attendance, but crucially their participation. How, in other words, to build a programme that, as well as being beneficial and inspirational, was also driven purely by the powerhouse that is the Univ community. And so the idea grew, as many, many more conversations took place, absorbing contributions and expertise from an ever widening circle of people, including the tireless Youth Development Office, without any exaggeration, the engine under the bonnet of the entire enterprise, and also the multi-talented group whose signatures you will have seen at the bottom of your invitation to be here tonight. Chris Burkitt, Jonathan Earl, John Horrigan, Philip Maniska, a group who've made bringing Univ in the Arts into being extremely enjoyable, as well as treating it with the seriousness it deserves. For the ambition of Univ in the Arts is considerable, and how could it not be? As I'm sure everyone in this room is aware, the humanities encompasses a wealth of subjects and skill sets. And that is why the Univ in the Arts programme is going to involve 3 events a year. 2 will follow the more classic format that we have tonight, with speakers and an audience Q&A, and a 3rd, which we're calling the Univ Salon, which is going to be a much smaller, more intimate event with workshop aspects, and we'll always be looking at different aspects of the creative process. That's what Univ Salon is going to be all about. We're very excited about it, and the very first salon will take place on the 27th of November in the Groucho Club, under the umbrella title Inspiration and a Blank Page. You will be receiving more information about that and a chance to buy tickets pretty soon in your inboxes. I have to confess that when the Master's request, many months after our initial conversation, for me to formally help fine-tune and bring Univ in the Arts into being came along, it wasn't, shall we say, the most convenient time in my life. I had just signed a contract to write a new book for delivery last week. I had also just taken possession of a very lively and demanding golden doodle puppet. But it was instantly clear to me that I had to say yes, simply because it was just such a brilliant idea. Not just as a way of tapping into the rich seams of Univ talent enabling important conversations to take place, like the one we're going to have tonight, but also as a way of fostering a sense of community amongst all those of us who were lucky enough to pass through Univ's doors. A very sense of community which made my time at the college, and yours I'm sure, so valuable and so treasured. I'm now going to hand over to John Earle, graduate of English in 1980 and publisher with, among others, Macmillan, OUP, Thames and Hudson. John is going to introduce you to and host the conversation between our distinguished historian visitors. And so thank you again for coming, and I know we are in for a treat.
Wow, follow that. Good evening all, it's great to see you all. It's wonderful to see such a packed room with some familiar faces, obviously, not all, but great to see you all. So as Amanda says, I was a graduate at Univ in 1980, but that meant my education was very much a 70s education. I'm a bit of a 70s guy, I think, but it's nice to see a lot of fellow 70s students here. Welcome to you all. I think the nice thing about being part of the community is that with Simon and Alex, we represent, as it were, 3 different decades of Univ life. Alex was at Univ in the mid-90s, Simon in the early 80s, and I was there in the mid-70s. So it's nice to represent a good sort of 30-year span, 25-year span of Univ life. So, on to our speakers. Alex is a number of things. She's a historian, she's a writer, a journalist, and also a screenwriter. Alex has published 3 superb pieces of historical analysis with Simon Schuster, their subjects being Cuba, India, and the Suez Canal crisis. They've received plaudits from figures such as Victoria Leopold, Tom Holland, and Sir Martin Gilbert, all of whom have written really superb reviews of these great books. Alex is also very, very keen on film, and that's reflected in her 4th publication with Atlantic Books called Real Histories. This relates very closely to the column that Alex writes occasionally in The Guardian, which essentially looks at the relationship between film and history, a subject I suspect we may find ourselves encountering this evening. And as you know, a subject that is almost constantly in the news, all about authenticity and other such things. Alex is a screenwriter herself, as I mentioned. She was responsible for the screenplay of the Churchill film. You might say, which Churchill film? The film called Churchill, which was released in 2017, starring Brian Cox and Miranda Richardson. And Alex wrote the screenplay for that. So she has a tremendously varied and exciting CV, and we're absolutely delighted to welcome Alex this evening. Simon Winder, whom I've known for many, many years, I think probably about 30. We worked together at Macmillan back in the 80s, amazingly enough. Also has a very wide-ranging CV. He is a historian, he's a publisher, he's an editor too, as well as being a publisher. As a historian, Simon's written 3 books, All for Picador, which is an imprint to Macmillan. The first is a book about James Bond, and Bond's relationship with post-war Britain, what he means to post-war Britain, the man who saved Britain. Simon then went on to write 2 vast, sometimes surreal, incredibly brilliant histories of Germany and the Habsburg Empire, called Germania and Danubia. And again, like Alex's work, they've certainly garnered some fantastically positive reviews. People like Alan Massey, Christopher Clark, have been very, very good receiving Simon's work, as is Philip Hensher, for example. And those books were not only successful in review terms, but also they both hit the Sunday Times bestseller lists. So Simon seems a great success there. Simon's day job, however, is publishing director for Allen Lane and Penguin Press. A list that I would probably, with my publishing hat on, say is just about the best history list in the world. So the authors that Simon will be used to dealing with will include people like Ruth Harris, Jeff Dyer, Niall Ferguson, the great historians of Nazi Germany, Richard J. Evans and Ian Kershaw. It's a stellar list, and Simon has been working with authors of that stature for the last probably 15 or 20 years now. So Simon is a publisher with Penguin, and also he edits some of the Penguin classics, which is, I think, a bit of a treat, but perhaps not something you want to do all the time. So anyway, that's the very impressive background of my two speakers this evening. We have books available for sale after the event. We have them over there if you'd like to take a look. They're all available in paperback. And if you'd like to have either Alex or Simon sign the books, then do please feel free. We're not going to have a full signing session after the discussion. We're going to have a full drinking session instead. But if you'd like to come up with a pen, then I'm sure Alex and Simon will be very happy to oblige. So that concludes my introduction. And just while I move over to ask the questions, perhaps you could give our speakers a nice warm Someone once said, and actually the provenance of this particular quotation is disputed by many people, so that perhaps proves the point. What is history but a fable agreed upon? How do you as historians respond to that statement? Can there be such a thing as historical truth?
Start.
It's funny being in a Univ context again. This seems to me like a tutorial from some kind of nightmare. Having had too much seafood the night before or something. So, thank you very much for your warm welcome. When Jonathan suggested this question about how much of a fable history is last night, I spent ages and ages lying awake thinking, how on earth do you respond to that incredibly complicated question? But I think it is true that history is a fable, but equally, I was just thinking that if you think about fiction as being, there seem to be two different categories, non-fiction and fiction. But if you take a great novel, like say Little Dorrit, that in many ways what we think of as being the fictional elements of Little Dorrit are actually extremely small. Like that Little Dorrit is obliged to behave in ways which the readers recognised in the Victorian period as being true and correct. Her life is very constrained in all kinds of ways. Dickens has to work very hard to create an environment for Little Dorrit, which, whether it's talking about trains or legal systems or what people eat or how they travel, she's incredibly constrained within a realistic environment, rather than it being actually, the element which is made up is relatively small, and this is in a fictional context. And so, for example, Little Dorrit, she can't have, say, 3 husbands. She can't use her magic powers to turn herself into Big Dorrit and get her own back on her enemies. She can't use laser guns to destroy everyone. Or there's a huge range of things she can't do. And therefore, even in the context of fiction, you have actually a structure which is almost entirely real and true and historically accurate. And then the plot filters through the middle of that, surrounded by great chunks of non-fiction. Whereas history, I suppose, in an odd way, is more fictional than fiction, because the actors within history have no idea how it's going to turn out. There's a much closer link between Little Dorrit, the author, and the outcome, and in the reader's mind, than there is in the context of history, where you have to keep bearing in mind the whole time that the shape of what we understand as a particular historical event is absolutely opaque to the people involved. It's not as though anyone, for example, fighting the 30 Years' War said, there's only 6 months to go, lads. Keep it up. If we can make it to the Treaty of Westphalia, there'll be peace afterwards. Or I always think about my grandmother, who lived in southeast London during the Second World War. And I remember in extreme old age asking her what it was actually like, because she would always refuse to talk about it. She hated it so much. But she said that at one point she gave birth to one of my uncles in an underground shelter wearing her nightie and a tin hat, and that I think she said that they were underground for 3 months in a row every night, and it was a nightmare. But she said what was really nightmarish was that she felt at the time this was going to be forever, and that therefore the shape, the heroic shape that we give to, say, the Blitz, the idea that we come through it, wasn't available to the people at the time. And so, in some ways, I think history is a fable, because the shape of it, what we look at as being outcomes, is absolutely mysterious to everybody who's actually involved in that story. And so, if no one at Agincourt, the French aren't turning up at Agincourt in order to become symbols for overweening pride and incompetence. They're expecting to win. That both sides in a battle, to have a battle, both sides must believe at some level that they can win, and one side turns out to be incorrect. So I guess I would say that history is a fable in many ways. That because the tragedy of the people involved, the people you're reading about, is that they have there is no neat outcome. There is no plot outcome which allows the novel, as it were, to end. It just continues.
Yeah, I mean, history, when we read it, imposes a narrative which doesn't exist exactly for that reason. History sort of emerges organically from things that happen. And even I remember hearing about one very sort of well-known historian who decided that he was so bothered by the amount of kind of imposition of narrative that he'd taken to just publishing books that were just collections of documents with sort of no commentary. But even that, of course, is a narrative because you're selecting the documents. So actually, you still aren't actually replicating what history is really like. There's always a selectivity there. And when we come to the kind of fables that people sort of worry about, things like, that history sort of becomes either sort of part of a nationalistic myth, or it becomes entertainment, film and TV, or it becomes part of people's identity and so on. Of course it does become fableized because you very selectively pick the bits that suit the agenda of that.
But also I think there's that sort of anxiety also that there's no point at which history ever stops, and therefore just by stopping reading a book with 600 pages gives it a shape which, my ideal would be to write a book which went on indefinitely and where you couldn't tell how many pages were still to come. Like the idea of a page numberless Kindle would be the ideal, because that would be the real experience. And I also I've been doing some writing quite a lot at the moment about the Duchy of Burgundy in the late Middle Ages, and the Burgundians are obsessed with history, and it's the first glimpses you get of a modern idea of history in the 15th century, and you have this. But its roots remain in religious morality, as it were. Like the point of history is to understand that everything ends in failure. That you have these exemplary figures. So, say someone like Charles the Bold decorated his tent, his travelling palace, as it were, with these enormous tapestries, some of which survive, of people like Alexander the Great and Hector and so on. But it was understood that these people were that it was part of your duty, in effect, to fail. And when Charles the Bold was eventually opened up like a tin can by Swiss mercenaries, and kind of his career comes to an end. I like to think that there was a few moments where he thought that this was beautifully appropriate, and perhaps he might feature in some future tapestry himself.
But of course, and that's the thing, people will of course look to history for lessons. They look for a purpose. Even the sort of oft repeated, those who do not study the past are condemned to repeat it, is about looking to history for lessons which you then have to pick out of it rather selectively, which may well not be there. If you are looking to history to find answers to present questions, of course it's going to, because it's always different. It doesn't perfectly repeat itself. It's always going to be a fable.
You've done all this work on Churchill. Don't you think that is an exemplary figure in terms of
the big man?
Can't tell.
Yes, absolutely. And now is somebody with a legacy that's increasingly disputed. That I think I certainly think over the next 5 or 10 years we're going to probably see a lot more kind of negative takes on Churchill, because these are coming up from places like India, where previously, there's been sort of a big book published, in the last few years about his involvement in the Bengal famine, and I'm sure there will be these reassessments coming, from kind of parts of the world where we haven't really seen Churchill books come from before. And then there'll be some lovely history wars over that, because then people will find that very difficult as well.
And he himself, I suppose, as a historian, it's not as though he was sitting around thinking, I have to wait till essentially old age until I become a major political figure again. The 30s are a genuine period of dismay for him. I mean, it's a miserable time.
Of course, and there's a story that he said, that history will be kind to me for I intend to write it, but he didn't. It's another myth. I mean, there are so many myths. I think the number of fake Churchill quotes around are only exceeded by fake Gunty quotes.
But it's interesting, Alex, because you mentioned the fact that obviously there is publishing around this, but also a lot of the current interpretations of Churchill are happening on the big screen, and obviously you were a part of that particular discussion. I mean, how do you see the license, as it were, that a screenwriter like yourself and filmmakers should have in actually interpreting history? Or how much do you think they should accord with, so-called designated ideas?
I mean, I think that anyone producing any artistic work needs to have complete freedom of speech and complete freedom of creativity. I then think historians, part of their job is, of course, to reassess that, and I'm very glad that I was very lucky to have a space in The Guardian for a long time, to have a column where I could assess that sort of history and sort of begin that discussion, and that discussion often became very lively, but no, certainly films and books must be made in an atmosphere of creative freedom, and it's interesting that it does always come up with film. I mean, you don't get people saying, well, we must stop performing Richard III because it's so dreadfully libelous and this Shakespeare man is terrible, whereas we sort of understand that some abstractions allowed, that actually that's a character study, it's not a literal history. But for some reason with film and television, people get terribly upset about it, and I do wonder whether there's a little bit of a class issue in there, whether we sort of trust theatre audiences or the readers of books, for instance. I mean, for instance, I've read 2 absolutely excellent historical novels this year that I can think of, Lincoln in the Bardo by George Saunders and The Underground Railroad by Colson Whitehead, both of which actually, the first of which is actually about ghosts, which didn't exist at all. So it's, really sort of a fantasy version of history, and the second of which literalises the Underground Railroad as a physical railroad, so it's a sort of sci-fi history, and yet I think they're fabulously insightful. You wouldn't want to curtail the production of these creative works, but we do seem to understand that theatre and book consumers can differentiate, whereas we sort of don't think film and TV people can.
Yes, I used to, when I was working in New York, I used to know this wonderful guy called Richard Hovhannissian, who was an Armenian who worked on the Armenian genocide at a time when there was very little on it. But he was saying how he lived in Los Angeles, well, like many Armenians, and he was saying once a year he and all his friends would get together and make dinner, have lots of drinks, and watch Lawrence of Arabia. And they loved watching Lawrence of Arabia because it showed lots of Ottomans being killed. But there's always one part of the ritual of watching Lawrence of Arabia, which he said is incredibly accurate. But there was one point where one of his friends would always ritually shake his head and tut-tut because that particular flag of the Ottoman army was only introduced the following month, or something like that. So he always viewed this as being this hideous, besmirching disaster in the midst of this world. So I think you can always... I have reliable information that Lawrence of Arabia is accurate, except, of course, it's absurdly inaccurate because it's not as though there was a camera there or, most people there have never met Lawrence.
No, Churchill actually had a go at writing a Lawrence of Arabia screenplay. He, in fact, did write one, early on, but it wasn't the one that got produced. So, we all know that feeling in the business. I empathise with Churchill on that front. But yes, he did. He wrote that, and he wrote one about... he wrote several screenplays, actually. He worked with Alexander Korda for a while. So, you see, I sort of feel that when you're taking him on, you also have to bear in mind that he was a big film fan, and it's interesting that lots of politicians have been from very, very different political stripes. They've understood the sort of relationship between film, national identity and history and propaganda. Certainly Churchill did. His favourite film was That Hamilton Woman, which he watched many times. That Hamilton Woman, with Laurence Olivier and Vivien Leigh. And apparently I think he watched it about 50 times or something, which, honestly, I've watched it a couple of times and I don't think I could do 50, but, good luck to you if you try.
Yeah, I love films from that period, but it's more or less unwatchable, I think.
It's pretty bad, yeah.
It's not accuracy, it's just the levels of boredom.
Yeah, that's the main problem, yeah.
When you were working on the Churchill screenplay, were you conscious of sort of treading on the toes of the 20th century giant, It was an issue of respect there, or...?
Well, you see, the thing is, I felt it was absolutely fine because I was commissioned by a small start-up company. It was my first screenplay, so I thought, that's fine, it'll never be made, I can do what I like, it doesn't matter. No one will never see the light of day, no problem. And then sort of all of a sudden it was cue sort of massive panic. It's been interesting because having sort of started out as someone who was quite, was employed to kind of dissect historical films and then to move from, gamekeeper to poacher in this way is quite alarming to do. And it does make you think about it, think about sort of what your responsibilities are. I mean, I do sort of hope that filmmakers would take some kind of responsibility, but I'm also now very aware of the process. For instance, if you're commissioned to write a feature film screenplay, you will be given probably 10 weeks. Now, that's not enough time to read anything like the literature on someone like Churchill. Fortunately I had read some before, but not, many people approaching that simply won't have, and I think that sometimes explains why you get some very strange ideas in films, such as in the recent Alan Turing movie, The Imitation Game, where he is seen as being mixed up with the Cambridge spies, who he definitely never met. and certainly was not blackmailed by, and did not get mixed up with. And I think possibly the writers just didn't know what a big deal that would be to suggest that. I think they just sort of found another interesting element and thought, this will be fun, without sort of realising that they were saying he was potentially a traitor.
Yes, there's one book I'm working on at the moment with Jeff Dyer, which is like a short book on Where Eagles Dare, called Broadsword, calling Danny Boy, for those who enjoy that great movie. And one of the interesting discussions, obviously it's a curious film because it's both incredibly boys' own and exciting as a movie, and a sort of travesty of the founding disaster of European history, reduced to the antics of Richard Burton and Clint Eastwood. But one of the curious things about it is that the plot only works because of the helicopter, and of course helicopters haven't been invented yet. And so Jeff has this, whenever he talks you through the whole film, but whenever anyone walks past the helicopter, he just refers to the way that the helicopter is essentially patiently waiting to be invented. It's sheepishly in the middle of the screen. But again, it's like without the helicopter, this eagle's nest-like castle, the action couldn't happen. Therefore, they were obliged to have this Nazi helicopter, which is obviously sort of like appalling fantasy of futurity, which doesn't happen.
Well, I mean, in the Brad Pitt film of Troy, it was shot in Mexico, so in the marketplace there's loads of llamas. Not have been in ancient Greece, unless they could really swim very well.
Alex, in your own work, you'll continue to explore this sort of dual approach, both writing books on history and also working screenplays. They've got some interesting plans coming up.
I'd certainly like to, if people keep employing me to do these things. Yes, and I think I'm getting more and more interested in sort of the uses of history and in actually sort of the process of making it as well, as an idea. And I think, the two novels I've mentioned earlier both sort of break that down in a very interesting way about the making of it. And the other thing that's really made me think about it recently, a very interesting use of history, is thank goodness I booked ages ago and got tickets to Hamilton, which is currently on in the West End, and is such an interesting way of looking at history. Again, very kind of unusual, although actually I think pretty accurate mostly. There's a few changes, but they're quite minor and they're quite intelligent changes. But how to approach the founding fathers through hip hop is an incredibly fresh idea. It works extremely well. But then of course there have been some criticisms of that by doing this colourblind casting and having a multiracial cast and using kind of hip hop, they're presenting it. I mean, actually, of course, these people are all slave owners. Yeah. So are they erasing a history by presenting it as liberational?
Yes, I suppose one of the many wonderful things about Hamilton is the way that this is a notoriously crushingly boring period in terms of ability to present it to me. I love the 18th century, but as an editor, I'm aware that people just zone out completely. I feel everyone should read Smollett and Fielding and so on, but no one does. Sometimes I thought I should boost Penguin's sales figures by ordering some copies on Amazon for myself, just so that the ghost of Smollett will feel slightly happier. But suddenly along comes Hamilton, and suddenly this period, which is just like absolute doldrums, suddenly comes to life. And I think that's amazing. I mean, it doesn't really matter the context. Suddenly there is a way in which and obviously the lyrics are extremely good on quite elaborate issues to do with the financing of the young republic and things like that.
It makes it remarkably interesting, very boring subject. But it's also, that's another point to make, which I think I always end up bringing up when people sort of say, oh, but aren't you worried that this film or your film, how dare you change history, how dare you kind of present the wrong version, aren't you worried that films will kind of corrupt minds? And I think, well, actually, no, because what happens is, the minute that they're on, for instance, when The Tudors was on television, loads of Tudor historians, oh my God, how could they make this? Oh, it's terrible, terrible. Well, sales of books on the Tudors went up, though, so people were looking for the real story. Actually, if you get people's interest, they will look further. And I think crucially on that, and this is, I'm a bit of a broken record on this, but it's very relevant since we're talking about the humanities tonight, is that actually one of the things that it makes me really sad that in schools now, decreasingly, they just don't seem to teach critical thinking anymore. And I think that's the most important thing the humanities can bring to the table. And in the world with fake news and, all these things, we need to be able to navigate these things. Yep. And actually, this is what the humanities can really bring to you, is kind of teaching you to distinguish between these things. You should be able to appreciate Shakespeare and not think it's real. This is quite fundamental. And, I think, certainly University College Oxford does, or at least certainly did when I was there, I'm sure it still does, but schools, I think, don't now. And I have heard from my friends who are academics that you do now get undergraduates arriving who aren't prepared for that shift, aren't ready necessarily to start doing it, they're very confused by it, and that's worrying. I think we need to kind of, I've heard of some schools actually where they do a wonderful thing, which I, sort of have talked to various people about because of the column I did, where they will run a kind of optional course. So they'll show a historical film. And the school I heard about was doing Carve Her Name with Pride, which I think is a great choice. And then they'll, as a class, discuss it with the real story and with the documents and discuss why changes were made. And that's brilliant. That's exactly how you could teach a really intelligent approach to history.
Yeah, and also fiction has a role here, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Your own love of fiction, but also you think about Erin Mantell. She's probably brought that world to millions of people who otherwise wouldn't know it.
Yeah, I always think of Asterix, to be honest, and that's my inspiration. I don't quite sure where I've been with that Asterix. I have no earlier memories than thinking they were really funny, and that therefore the Roman Empire was really funny, and everything to do. They're a joke, but equally they're painful. They're obsessively accurate within the constraints of everything being completely mad. So I'd like to say that my infant hands picked up Gibbon, but actually it's not true.
Well, a friend of mine who's a historian did his master's on film representations of the Arthurian legend, and he asked lots of medieval historians what their favourite film about this was, and they all said Monty Python and the Holy Grail, because actually it's really well researched. If you look at it, a lot of the jokes are very funny because they're actually situated in that period. It's actually rather intelligent.
Well, Terry Jones himself has a little bit of a track record, does he not, as a medieval historian?
Yeah, absolutely.
Talking of comedy, Simon, as people probably would have gathered, Simon has a rather baroque, very exciting comic style. Is anything, would you say, untouchable in comic terms as a historian?
I think probably when I was writing Germania, I was definitely scouting. I ended it with the Third Reich coming to power on the grounds that essentially I couldn't maintain a comic tone at that point, and it just seemed impossible to do that. Though the book does make fun of them, I've had some grief from the German far right for deriding the whole nature of the obsession with Wagner and all the rest of it. I mean, the Nazis do come into the book simply because they themselves used history so revoltingly in order to prove various points. I mean, you keep bumping. I talk a bit about this little town in East Germany called Quedlinburg, which is a blameless little town, and you go up to the abbey at the top. And it's curiously modern and clean inside and doesn't look dilapidated, but it turned out that Himmler turned it into an SS shrine during the Third Reich, and Henry the Fowler, the sort of original ruler of Germany in some ways, was buried there. And so what happened in Abbey for a group of, for several centuries had been a convent, a sort of aristocratic women's republic, this very small place, and the women there's job was to pray for the soul of Henry the Fowler. They'd all been kicked out by the Napoleonic period, but then this whole place had been converted into this. So, I talked a lot about that place because it is a particularly chilling and grim environment that's something which is to do with, in effect, compassion on the past, and prayerfulness was. Henry the Fowler was turned into this sort of Nazi icon, effectively, as the centre of this network of SS temples. And it was a very peculiar place to go to, but that's the only context in which. So I do think that is. I think the Third Reich is probably the only thing, actually.
There was a bit of a. To invoke a fellow Univ alumnus, Andrea Nucci, of course, just made this film, The Death of Stalin, which some people very much objected to. I thought was terrific, actually. I particularly thought it was terrific as somebody who has myself written on sort of Soviet politics in the Cold War. And I thought, I'm not just saying this because he went to our college, but I think it was actually incredibly insightful on how that works. And it was comedy, but also the comedy was very, very carefully directed. It was directed at the ridiculousness that system could throw up between those people. It was not directed at the victims of that regime, and it was not. And for that reason, I didn't find it tasteless. I found it actually quite clever in terms of how it approached those characters. But I think, of course, it's incredibly hard to balance these things, and I don't possibly not to be tempted by the amateur comedy about these things. But, of course, you can. The Producers is comedy about the Third Reich. It can be done.
Yep.
Simon, what about the sources of your ideas? What do you have in mind when you came up with the books that you would?
I suppose, as usual, I think everyone writes books which they would wish existed. I suppose that's. And I guess I was living in New York, and I became very obsessed with the end of the Cold War. It struck me as being just an astonishing thing. And even though I had no money at the time, for reasons I simply can't remember anymore, I flew from New York to Hamburg and wandered around Eastern Germany. And this was only like a few months after the end of after actually reunification. And so it was still very much a damp, battered place, but it just struck me as being historically so interesting and so loaded. And because I was so ignorant about it, I felt for various reasons, I'd always been interested in English history or French history or whatever, and I just wasn't really very knowledgeable at all. I sort of gave myself a kind of adult education, I suppose, in Germany, and so I sort of wrote the book as a side effect of wanting to try and explain to people why I was interested, and so it just kept on growing. But the book was a sort of side effect, I think, in some ways.
It's quite a lengthy project, wasn't it? You spent a lot of long weekends over
Yeah, a lot of sausages. Yeah, absolutely. I think also it probably helped having a young family, so there was a real incentive to get away. I paid the price later on, unfortunately.
And then was there sort of natural extension to that?
Yes. I mean, it's funny because I wrote Germania within the constraints of the United Germany. I sort of thought I'd write a book almost entirely within those borders. But that turned out, once I finished it, to be a really bad idea because, of course, Germany spills out on either side. So I felt a bit like a sort of drunk in a shooting range at a fair. I'm aiming at this target, but I keep on hitting the pink dog or the owner. And I had to write these additional books in order to try and, so Danube is about Germans in the east, and then that turned out to be also about Hungarians and so on. But it was all those Germans in places like Austria had missed out. And then the book I've just finished called Lotharingia is really about the German-French issue and this great borderland, which again is another great bunch of German speakers or Germanic speakers in one way or another. So I should have written one book, but it's turned into three just through incompetence.
But at that particular point, you will have closed the book on Germany, I guess.
Yes. And also I wrote this just so I could say to complete the trilogy in a sort of Star Wars-y kind of way.
And Alex, what about yourself?
Well, I always think when people you sometimes get asked, by people who want to be writers, they sort of say, how do you think of ideas? And the answer is, if you're not thinking of ideas yet, it's not time to start writing. The way you think of ideas, in my opinion, is that you consume constantly books, films, television, anything else, theatre, music, anything that comes to you. You have to be reading all the time if you want to be writing. And actually, I constantly read books and watch films that I think halfway through, I should have thought of this. Oh, this is brilliant. Oh, it's so good. But then what you find is that you then have ideas springing off that, and that's where the sort of creativity comes from. You need to be... it's a cliche to say you have to be a reader before you're a writer, but you do. It's also very true, I think.
It's like one of the people I'm happiest to publish is the sort of philosopher, political scientist John Gray. And he was on Desert Island Discs last weekend. This fantastic thing was I'm much more proud of what I've read than what I've written. And that's what I mean. It's like such a profound and obviously true thing, because it's like, it's what you read in the end, which is far more important,
But for yourself, Alex, 3 regional subjects, Cuba, India, the Suez, obviously 20th century in all cases, but quite a wide range of subjects for selection.
Yes, my agent keeps telling me I need to stop learning about entire new countries every time I write a book. I think they're all linked in a sense. Like, I sort of see them as a trilogy as well, but you sort of tend to, don't you, see false narratives being imposed on history. This is not how I wrote it at all, but now I think it is. They are all kind of about the Cold War. They're all about British and American imperialism after the empires stop, and how that kind of relates to itself, and about sort of, how those forms of control, work after theoretically the empire is gone. So, they do have a kind of linking thing, but yes, I think having discussed how, at the time I wrote them, I certainly couldn't necessarily have seen that. So yes, possibly I'm imposing this narrative.
Yeah. Talking of the times that we're living in, we are living in interesting times. How does the historian cope with all that's going on at the moment?
Hide, write more books about history.
Over to you, Alex.
yes, not next time. Yes, I think I'm very wary as a historian of trying to predict the future or even to talk too much about the present. I remember at Univ that Leslie Mitchell was of the opinion that we shouldn't do any papers post 1900 because you couldn't possibly know what you thought about those things yet. It was far too recent. And then here am I doing the Cold War. He'd be most disappointed, no doubt. I think when I went back to Univ, having been, an undergraduate who was very interested in lots of things like journalism, and he said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I'm a historian, Leslie." He laughed for about 5 minutes. But yes, he was of the opinion that you could, and I think there is an extent to which I would say something that, to me, I suppose, a bit is the cut-off is the release of papers. Mm-hmm. I mean, I wouldn't be that confident writing about anything where papers weren't out yet. But as you'll know from publishing, it's very popular to write very recent histories.
I think that's probably true, isn't it? Because Leslie was right in as much as saying the shape of the Cold War was hidden. Therefore, if the Cold War's roots were the Second World War, at the time, I remember him saying that to me, and I thought that's ridiculous. Obviously, the 20th century is far more fun. It's more than. And but as a historian, maybe it wasn't too early. I remember discussing yesterday, for example, how work on the British Empire is really in its early stages. It's like because for a long time it was almost invisible. You couldn't really work out what had happened.
Yes, I think that's probably true. It's sort of too much everywhere to be separated, and it probably still is. But I do think perhaps that's something where historians can be somewhat useful, is looking at sort of how history is used and looking at those trends. I mean, certainly when you're looking at something like the British Empire, which is now, highly controversial, and which really the kind of debate on that is often extremely polemical from both sides. Mm-hmm. We were sort of, Simon and I have definitely been discussing this and kind of, feeling like, my feeling is very much that we need to get away from from a balance sheet approach on that completely, and approach it much more on its own terms of the past, and stop trying to find evidence that it was either the best thing ever or the worst thing ever, and approach it. But it's very hard to do that because people are emotionally bound up in it, and that's the problem with how history relates to the present as well, is that it is part of people's identity and they do feel strongly about it one way or another.
So I suppose the one thing that's been really dominated the book I've just finished was I became really interested in the way, and it's a really obvious point, obviously everyone would agree this is hardly controversial, but I was very struck by the way that humans have always been incredibly sophisticated. That there's no point in, however far back you go, human society has always been extraordinarily complex and unstable and ambitious. Or like I've spent a lot of time in places like Aachen and places like that, or Trier, these extremely ancient places. And I remember talking to the Oxford historian Barry Cunliffe once, and who's a specialist in prehistory, and he was saying, the first thing we know about Western Europe in written terms is Julius Caesar arriving there, and he writes about it, and we don't know anything earlier than that. But he's saying, but when he reached the English Channel, he would have seen that the English Channel filled with big, sophisticated ships, doing elaborate trading deals with entirely literate crews, and that the idea that literacy is essential to human sophistication is completely untrue. That in effect, the heavy lifting of being a human in this part of Europe, say, or anywhere, was done before anyone could write anything. That domesticating wheat is probably much more important than the internet, for example. So it's those sorts of things where I was continually bugged by the sense that one of the issues around the British Empire is the way that it's so easy to patronise the past in some way or another, or downgrade it or view it as being sillier or more incompetent or whatever. But in fact, there's no point. You go back and back and back, and everyone, say Charlemagne, is visiting various. When Charlemagne is emperor in 800, he's ruling a polity which has its Christian roots to say four centuries earlier. So it's already ancient, and he goes to these cathedrals which are great buildings, but which have been knocked down and replaced since, but they were great buildings then. So it's that sort of feeling that the danger of using history now as a basis for beating ourselves up about the past implies that we're on some higher plane, when of course we're making exactly the same grotesque mistakes as the past.
Well, or to be neutralised, to have pride or shame in it is a problem. Is to impose those are our feelings. That's not what history is.
Ultimately, history doesn't care about feelings. What he really hated was this contemporary idea of, what's he called it? He calls it boo-hoo history, that was it. Where like everything's just sad and incompetent because it's in the past. It's like, isn't it terrible the way people did this or that? Because the way it lets off the person who's speaking from thinking, well, actually, we're probably doing versions of the same thing now in different ways, which we choose to ignore in some way.
Yeah, absolutely. We're talking of sophisticated individuals. The leader of the free world is sort of making history as he goes along, isn't he? From the day of his inauguration, there was this sense that wasn't what we saw, this is what actually happened. Is that a challenge for the historian?
I think history can be really useful, actually, because I read this marvellous history, the latest volume in the Oxford History of the United States, which deals with the 1860s, 70s and 80s. And it's stuffed with presidents which are just as bad. And so it's incredibly encouraging to feel that it's very easy to see Trump as a unique monster. But in fact, that people like Rutherford Hayes and Grover Cleveland are just astonishingly inept. Or there's the second... Benjamin Harrison, that was it. So talking to Benjamin Harrison was like standing in a cold, damp cave. and the levels of corruption and silliness, and I mean, there's a strong, you could celebrate Trump as being a classic of irresponsible American idiocy in the continent, which has a grand tradition, effectively, which America survives.
Well, America survives, but that's when people say, for instance, Andrew Jackson. But loads of Native Americans didn't survive Andrew Jackson, for instance. So there's also a sort of worry about, what survives.
Yes, no, and there's a danger of being wholly passive and saying, oh well, because things are terrible, then that's fine. But on the other hand, the idea of that America is a uniquely has uniquely high standards, which have now collapsed under Trump. Effectively, there's been several waves of collapse. When there's a major national emergency, then the system does kick in and become more serious. So maybe one could see Trump as being a side effect of not being those huge issues which created people like Eisenhower as president or whatever.
On the plus side, it's been fantastic for the reputation of George W. Bush, who people now seem to think was a very serious statesman.
Yes, you have a musical actually.
Yeah.
Bush.
Absolutely. Great, well I think on that note we'll wrap up the discussion and we'll move to questions and answers. But first of all, I hope you've enjoyed the conversation and please give Simon and Alex a round of applause. Which I guess I will roll with.
Yes, I've got a question which touches on what you said about the Underground Railroad, which, like you, I found absolutely fascinating and haunting. The problem you have with reading it is that you accept the whole thing as a poetic truth, but you're wondering which bits are literally true. And since you don't know the period in that detail, how do you decide which is literally true? Does it matter? There's a kind of rider which comes out of the movies on Churchill and The Darkest Hour, which you watch and are aware that a lot of it is true and some of it's made up and some of it is distorted and some of it is false, and you can handle that. But the problem with that is people who come along later generations are watching and think everything is literally true. So I've asked a two-point question. How do you decide which bits are literally true and does it matter?
Well, that used to be what I wrote about in my column, exactly, was kind of fishing around for the literal truth in films. And sometimes I was actually very pleasantly surprised, that we'd gone to quite big efforts to get it right. But yeah, I mean, obviously, I also watched quite a lot of Mel Gibson movies, and really, I mean, further from the truth is not possible to get much of the time. And so, I can say the same politically on the other side for Oliver Stone or for any one of these filmmakers who actually have a particular agenda that they're trying to push as well. So not only are they making a film that's full of fabrication, but that's actually very deliberate because they're pushing a certain political line a lot of the time. And I think, that is obviously a little disconcerting because these things are effective. I mean, a reason that Churchill himself and also many other leaders of different stripes, such as Stalin, Kim Jong-il, Muammar Gaddafi, all invested loads of money in film because they understood the power of that as a propaganda tool. Because yes, it is. It's something very believable about film as well. Because it's such an immersive experience. Does it matter? I think, as I say, I think it does have an effect. I absolutely do think that films have an effect. I mean, there was some research after Oliver Stone's JFK came out that showed that it had kind of increased or sustained the number of people who believed that Kennedy was killed by a conspiracy, which, as a historian who's written about it, I think he almost certainly was not. However, that film completely fabricates a case, makes up lots of elements of it, and then films it in a very documentary style, which of course makes it look like a sort of factual documentary. So it's sort of tricking you on several visual and intellectual levels, really. At the same time, I don't think you can stop films being made. I don't think you can stop artistic freedom. So I come back to my answer to this, really, is that, that we need to learn critical thinking from a very early age, and we need to understand that everything that we read and watch and consume is not always going to be accurate, and that we can't take things as if they're sort of completely true when we watch them. I mean, because also people will watch Star Trek in the future and not understand whether that's a historical document or something that is made up. So, future historians are going to have to fish through all of our weird cultural products in this way.
That also applies to the Underground Railroad, which I started with. How do we respond to the Underground Railroad when we're wondering which bits are true, which bits are literally true, which bits express a poetic truth? How do we...
I'm okay with assuming that that's all a poetic truth, although I think it's actually very well researched, and I think a lot of it is based on very much true stories. But I think I'm not sure I mind. I think we've come back perhaps to history being a fable agreed on, and that I'm confident that his research is, from what I know of the period, is fairly, is pretty good. But obviously the book has a poetic truth, which I think sort of is more important possibly than trying to fish out, well, did this happen in this town at this point? Perhaps that's a rather lesser question.
Yes, one thing, I don't teach, so I don't have to worry about this issue, but I always think anyone trying to understand the run-up to the Second World War, for example, in Britain, has to watch the great movie The Shape of Things to Come, based on H.G. Wells's book, and it was the most expensive British film of the 30s. And everyone apparently went to see it, and the picture it gives of the next war as being something which will destroy Britain, I think had an enormous impact. And the fact it's obviously not true, but effectively, retrospectively looking back on it, you can see it as being a profoundly true document, because you can just see that it would have, the special effects now seem quite cranky and peculiar and all the rest of it, but obviously that wasn't visible, that wasn't the case at the time. But that effectively that tells you more about the truth of how appeasement was positively viewed by the overwhelming majority of the population than anything else, because effectively this film accidentally preserves something which hasn't been changed. Our attitude was that film has changed, but it accidentally preserves in amber a particular period, a particular time, in a way which the fact it's a science fiction film is much less important than the fact it's wholly true to its period, and as a historical document, therefore much more valuable than Pathé News, say.
Well, this is a sort of fascinating aspect of historical fictions of films and books, is that you get a sort of double history out of them. So, for instance, The Ten Commandments is a sort of, won't tell you a lot about Moses, particularly historically, but is so interesting on McCarthyism, that particular film. It was made as a sort of rehabilitation for some of the actors in it who had been sort of re-educated, Edward G. Robinson and so on in it, and his character actually mimics that arc in the film. It's kind of, the pharaohs are the Soviets, the Americans are the Israelites. The film is extremely conscious of its time in that respect. So, sometimes these things can sort of tell you more than perhaps they even realise about the time they're made as well as the time they're looking at.
Questions?
Hi. Question really is around how you perceive people in the 20th century. Do you feel there are any figures in history that can't be written objectively? In the case of Churchill, Martin Luther King, potentially Hitler as well, or anything where it's so polemised at the moment that they can't be an objective view?
Shall I start on that? It's a good question. I think all of those people, it's probably very difficult to write about objectively, although I think there are lots of people trying. But I think what you're contending with when you write about one of those figures, or someone like, say, Gandhi, who I've written about, or various, there are other people in that bracket, although not many, is that you're contending with a huge popular imagination. So, and this is also true when you write fiction about someone like Churchill, of course, you know. You're dealing not just with the reality. I mean, one thing that was controversial that I put in the Churchill film, for instance, is that I depicted a little his suffering from possible depression. Obviously, we can't retrospectively diagnose Churchill, but he, of course, wrote about his black dog. We know that he had some kind of, you know, sort of depressive aspect to him. And lots of people were very upset that I depicted that. And, you know, I sort of got quite a lot of negative pushback on that. It was as if I'd shown him as weak, which I think was very interesting, because actually that tells you a lot about the perception of mental illness, rather than, I personally don't think there's anything weak at all about suffering from depression. In fact, I think it's only more amazing that he did what he did while also, you know, suffering possibly from some kind of difficulty like that. But it was interesting because the problem with it was, you know, and again, Churchill's written about it, it's not hardly an unknown subject, but for some people it conflicted with the image they wanted, and that was a problem. So you actually find that sometimes people get upset because even if what you're saying might be more accurate than what they think, they hold this idea very dear. So when you're talking about writing about those sort of figures, I do think as a historian you have, you know, always you'll want to move towards objectivity, but there are also a lot of polemicists writing about those figures, and there's also a huge amount of public feeling. They're very controversial.
Yes, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think in some ways there are some plaster saints or death. I mean, I think I really like the Natalie Portman movie about Jackie Kennedy, for example. I thought that was
it's really good.
Really an enjoyable film, where they're obsessed with the accuracy of everything. You really did feel that it must have been something like that. And yet at the same time, you do think, oh, there's someone dressed up as Lyndon Johnson, you know, like, oh, and I only realised that was Bobby Kennedy about halfway through, because I'm like, who's this person she keeps talking to? You know, is he a security guard or something? I said, oh, Bobby, you know, and it's like, oh, it's Bobby Kennedy. You know, so there's an awkwardness there about the fact that obviously it is made up, you know, it's a drama, it's not, you know, they're not going to be. You know, like my one problem with, say, Gary Oldman was that this idea he has to wear these great lumps of rubber on his cheeks in order to look like Churchill, kind of thing. But that's
Brian Cox just looks like Churchill.
Yeah, it's a huge advantage. Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, it's cute. I mean, what I find frustrating as a publisher is I think there are various amazing figures. Like, I don't know, say, Lloyd George, for example. How do you write about Lloyd George? Not because it's off limits, but how do you write about Lloyd George so that people can understand how incredibly dynamic and interesting and what a whirlwind he was. Like, you can see this already with, say Tony Blair. You know, Tony Blair is just a universal hate figure. And yet, that wasn't true when he became Prime Minister. You know, it was extremely exciting when he became... And the same with Lloyd George, and the same with young Churchill, of course. You know, Churchill in his first iteration as a young liberal, tough guy. You know, young. There are great photos of Lloyd George and Churchill together before the First World War. You think that how do you capture as a historian that sense of why these people were so hated, but also why they were so adored in a way which, you know, inevitably you think about the older person. You think about the person who becomes, in effect, a caricature of themselves in some way. It's very difficult, I think. You know.
More questions?
Hello. I'm just wondering if there's a role for science to come to the aid of arts, of history, particularly recent history. I'm thinking of like the step change in things like meteorology, where, for example, last weekend we knew a week before that it was going to be snowing on Saturday and Sunday, and it actually did. When I was younger, the forecasts were notoriously bad, and you didn't know what was going to happen in 48 hours ahead, let alone a week ahead. But that's because of science, lots of data points, you know, millions and millions of data points, satellite images, temperature, pressure, and so on, all going into the system. So you can actually predict what's going to happen in something as complex as the weather a week ahead, or all the way around the world. Can we do something with history, particularly recent history, using the trillions of data points we have from people's words, the sounds, the pictures that people got on their iPhones and so on, the opinions that are expressed around the world? Can we use that to somehow go back and score people's views on what just happened?
Isn't that what Cambridge Analytica are in quite a lot of trouble for doing this, aren't they?
Because this question about fake news is a pretty important one, because the world's history will change as a result of people making up stories. But is there a role that science can play?
I think it probably is, but I think there's a great worry that effectively, I guess I'm just really leery of contemporary history because we don't know what it comes out. I mean, I don't know, different people would have different cut-off points. I'm not quite sure what the cut-off point is. But
just before your own lifetime.
Yes, yes. You need to feel confident that in some way you're... I mean, I agree that I'd say more broadly the role of science has been grossly neglected by historians. More broadly, not analytically, but just... I mean, I'm really lucky to publish this wonderful historian called David Edgerton, who is a proper technology historian, who, those harsh-looking people in morning coats who stand next to the prime ministers throughout the 20th century, who run things like ICI or Vickers or these enormous companies. He's really interested in those people and the idea that effectively Britain is a science-based country. What makes Britain striking in the 20th century and the 19th century is that it's a country which is obsessed with science, and yet is the narrative is created by non-scientists. So it's one of the great scientific nations, and yet the narrative never includes science in all kinds of weird ways. So he's just finished a book for us called The Rise and Fall of the British Nation, which puts the idea of science at the centre of describing 20th century Britain. And he's saying that we would never dream of treating Britain. Britain is babyishly treated by its historians as though it's like a football match as to who wins each election. He's saying who wins each election is very minor compared to what really matters, which is how does the country run itself? How are people fed? How are people? What are the things behind the politicians? We wouldn't dare to have a history of, say, Soviet Russia or 20th century Germany treated in such babyish terms as to see whether or not the Liberal Party is a bit bigger or a bit smaller. So it's that sort of. So I think there is an increasing role for science in the scientific story needs to be in there. I'm not sure about its use as analytics, because I guess I just tend to think that the past 20 years or so, from a historian's point of view, is totally mysterious.
I just think in terms of a narrative theory, think about mass observation, which is interesting. I mean, the Kynaston books, I think, are an amazing way of reading history, because you really do feel... I mean, clearly it's a selective process, but you do feel you're really looking very, very closely at history as it's being played out.
Yeah, I mean, I do think there are and there are efforts to, I think it's quite an interesting question, there are efforts to sort of, try to, crunch data together and produce that. I would actually be really interested, something I keep looking for and keeps not being done, is sort of to look at finances of the British Empire, a fantastically complicated question. There is some quite good economic history on it, actually, but there's also, when you've got so many variables, then actually this sort of old model of, a lone historian sitting there with the archives is quite, it's a big challenge to get on top of, and actually that, you might find that a kind of hugely complicated data system would be really useful. In terms of if you're talking about using all those recent analytics to, are you thinking kind of to assess recent behaviour, or are you thinking to predict the next stage?
Well, it's kind of just to kind of score opinion.
Score opinion, yeah.
The Russia case is a great example. You've got 150 million people in Russia, roughly something like 80% voted for Putin, or we think they did. But we don't actually really know what the real view of the people there about that is, or the people in Ukraine, or the people in China, who all have a story on it.
Right.
Technology allows you effectively to gather that data and actually try and reinterpret what actually just happened last week.
And you'd have the difficulty of having to read that data, because obviously in a lot of those societies, people aren't necessarily speaking in an open way about how they feel about those things, so it's kind of about reading subtleties. I think Weibo, the Chinese network, there's all sorts of quite subtle codes that you can have for opinions that you perhaps can't express too openly. So, there's no reason. I mean, technology is very sophisticated. There's no reason this couldn't be done. Should start the project. I think it'd be pretty good.
It's definitely true that, one of the big issues for historians will be to what extent, say, did Trump get elected through illegitimate uses of social media, And it's a giant question, and we don't know the answer. And it could become a new conspiracy theory, effectively, like JFK's assassination. That it's, is believing that social media manipulation gave the election to Trump in itself an anti-democratic idea, because it effectively just assumes that people vote for Trump because they're morons. But my wife's family is American, and tons of them think Trump's terrific, and the Russians haven't been anywhere. There's no rubles lurking.
Not eating borscht.
I think we've got time for one more question.
I was wondering if you guys are well-known authors, you've written lots of books, you're bestsellers. Could you address the issue of the divide between history that people read and write and buy and academic history that is increasingly unreadable, even by academics?
Yeah, that's interesting. I suppose I've spent like 20... Well, altogether, I suppose, as a history publisher, I've been around for about 30 years, and I suppose that whole time I've always just been cruising around looking for a particular kind of historian who happens to be able to write for a broad audience. But because of my own background, I read a huge amount of academic history, and I think they're just two different areas, and they're both essential to each other. And I find it hard to. I mean, when I'm wearing my Penguin Press hat, I'm obviously having to convince colleagues about that we should publish X book or Y book. But that's because in the end Penguin itself is a very specialised publisher, because it can only publish a certain kind of book which certain kinds of people like to read and are willing to pay 30 quid to read. But I myself just see it as being a funny subset, because obviously there are certain subjects, like for example pretty much anything to do with the 18th century, no one reads. And I happen to think that's tragic, but it's impossible to get people to read about the Georgians in almost any form. And
regardless of the nature of the text.
Well, that's the thing. Yeah, it's not that you can get to it. I mean, there's Amanda Foreman's famous book, for example. There's many on Georgiana. It was many years ago, and and it's incredibly difficult. But it couldn't be a more enjoyable period. I did a wonderful book. I edited this wonderful book on the Bohemians of Covent Garden in the 18th century, and everyone should read that book. It should be. I sometimes have this fantasy that we should use our marketing budget to put armed guards around Victoria Station during rush hour, and no one's allowed out to enjoy at least the first chapter of this book on the Bohemians. But obviously, it would be a misuse of that budget, and wider ramifications, which would be probably difficult to deal with. But there's that but how do you get people can't be forced to in our society? Sadly, it's one of the lacks in British society. They can't be forced to read anything, and therefore. There are whole huge areas where people, if only they knew, they would be able to enjoy it, but there just isn't a way in. But that's highly unstable. It keeps changing in various ways, I'd say.
Right, and meanwhile you get 20 new biographies of Anne Boleyn every year when there is literally nothing new to say about her, because people buy them. So there's a certain market issue here. I would also say a little bit in defence of academic historians, that actually I think there's a really good generation coming up of really smart, interesting young academic historians who absolutely would like to be communicating with the public, but of course they're also dealing with sort of research assessment exercises where they are required to produce very large numbers of books and papers very, very quickly, which is kind of the opposite of trying to produce this sort of good, considered, ambitious work. So they're working in a system which is actually kind of curtailing them, I think, to some extent there as well. And I do think it's quite hard for them to sort of make that leap when they're sort of having to produce quite so many pieces of work. That's what that tends you towards, is focusing on a very small subject and writing repeatedly about it in a way that is absolutely unreadable and boring. And I absolutely understand where you're coming from on this.
A very good example is the British Empire, which you obviously write about. I saw that one of my favourite empire historians, John Darwin, today, was a great genius on the idea of the systems that make empires. And he's just retired from Oxford, and he was saying how when he started off as an empire historian in the 70s, that he was viewed as mad on the grounds the British Empire was so obviously boring. It was both contentious and dull, and the exciting new Britain was to look forward to. I mean, there were almost nobody was studying it. And I remember when I first started working for Macmillan, but you couldn't get a decent history of, say, West Africa for love nor money. You know, it was really extraordinary how these enormous areas which no one was interested in, but it just requires an individual to step forward who actually does have that he or she has some insight which suddenly allows a subject to burst into life again. And so I guess I remain eternally hopeful, because each year we publish a number of books which do really well, and some of them by very young historians. Though I think always the idea of the young historian is always by definition annoying. It's like,
well, I mean, young for a historian is under 60.
Yeah, exactly. So I get so fed up with the marketing part. So yeah, it's really exciting because she's a young historian. It's like, oh, for God's sake, you know, it's like age is not unrelated to your ability to write decently. You know, it's anyway.
Yeah, definitely.
Great stuff. I think we better wrap up there, but I'd like to conclude by thanking Alex and Simon for this evening's conversation. We've covered a very wide range of topics. I hope you've enjoyed it, and thank you very much indeed for all contributed. Thank you.